Chapter 3. We spent the afternoon lounging around, trying to think of brilliant ways to get into the hospital. I was on the floor most of the time, wrapped in a tartan rug. I remember laughing at Chris, who was pretending to watch television. He was reacting to the flat grey screen as though there were some game shows and sitcoms and action movies on it. It was strange how TV had been such a major part of our lives, and now, without electricity, the TV had become the most useless thing in the house. Most of all, I felt pretty happy that day. It was because we were starting to get on well again. It only showed in little ways, but those little ways were my food, my drink, my air, my life. The others thought I was tough and independent, but I needed those 5 people more than I'd ever needed anyone or anything else in my entire existence. For all that, though, we still couldn't think of a way to get into the hospital. Night started to fall, then it fell, till it was lying all over the ground, and we still hadn't thought of anything. But I'll take a lot of the credit for the inspiration we finally had. I'd been idly thinking about Homer's crazy distraction tactic. It seemed to me that there were possibilities in the idea. He just hadn't done it right. Something was nibbling at my brain. There was a tiny mouse trapped in there. If I could find the key, I could let him out. "Lee," I said, when he was relieved by fee from sentry duty. "Yes, my beautiful, sexy caterpillar." "Caterpillar? That's what you look like, wrapped up in your rug. Thanks a lot. Listen, you remember that very quick conversation behind the shed after Homer finished whaling and frightened a poor innocent soldier out of his wits?" "Yes." "What did we say?" "There's something from that conversation that's bugging me." Caterpillars are always bugged. That's what makes them caterpillars. "Very funny, but I'm serious." "What did we say?" "I don't know. We were talking about how it was probably Homer who was making the noise." "Yes, and then?" "I can't remember. Just watching the guy running in and shutting the door, locking it so tight." "Yes, something about the way he was locking it." "You said something." "Yes, I did." I sat there frustrated. "Is it really important?" Lee said presently. "I don't know. I'm probably being stupid. I just think there's something there. If I can remember it and let it out. It's like watching a heifer calving. I can see the head of the damn thing, but I don't know what it's going to look like." I got up and started walking around. We were in an upstairs room, which Miss Lim must have used as a practice room. There was a beautiful black baby grand piano facing a window. Homer had written heavy metal across it in the dust with his fingers, but I'd seen Lee with the lid raised, running his hands across the keys. His fingers were trembling, and there was a look on his face even more passionate, more intense than when he looked at me. I'd been standing in the doorway watching when he noticed me. He lowered the lid quickly, almost guiltily, and said, "They ought to play the 1812, get the soldiers to provide the cannons." I didn't answer, just wondered why he tried to turn something that he felt so strongly about into a joke. There were times when I got sick of jokes. But now I did a tour of the room, swatting the blind cord, spinning the piano stool, rubbing out Homer's graffiti, straightening the books, opening the front of the grandfather clock, then closing it again. "Let's have an instant replay," Lee said, watching me. "Not very instant," I said, sitting at the piano stool and facing him. "But okay, let's." "All right." I don't think we said much till the guy was back through the door and closing it. We abused Homer a bit, that's all. Then we talked about how tightly he was locking it, and how they must have professionals and amateurs, like we thought, and how this guy must be. Wait, I sat there with my hands gripping my head. Suddenly it was there. I stood. "I've got it. Let's go find the others." That night, as Lee and I watched Homer from our hiding place, we thought again how there were advantages to being the wildest guy in the school. Homer knew some amazing stuff, while the rest of us had been studying product differentiation and price discrimination in economics. Homer and his mates at the back of the room had been training in urban terrorism. I don't know how they learnt some of the things they did. Homer was creeping out towards the outpatient section again, this time with Robin 50 metres behind on the lookout. He got to the door at the end of the building that he and Robin had tried before. This time he didn't bother with it, but went instead to the little metre-high door under the building, about halfway along. He had to grope his way through the lavender bushes to reach it, but from the angle we were watching we had a good view. I saw him pull on the door, but it must have been locked, as we had expected. He used a chisel then to try to lever it open, but that didn't work. Although the door seemed flimsy enough, it consisted only of 4 vertical white slats nailed to 2 crossbars. Homer was undeterred. However, he was well prepared. Homer was undeterred, however, and he was well prepared. His hand went to his bag of tools again and pulled out the screwdriver. He set to work on the hinges. It took 5 or 6 minutes. Then at last he took a firm hold on the door and lifted it gently off. Without a backward glance he wriggled. He's a big guy, Homer, through the opening. We couldn't see him anymore, but I knew exactly what he'd be doing. Lee and I both tensed, knowing that it was nearly time for us to go into action. I could picture Homer undulating through the cold, dark underworld like a big worm. He'd seemed so certain that his plan would work once I'd given him the initial idea, but after all, he was just recreating one of his more outrageous school stunts. He'd had a dress rehearsal. He had to find a place to make a hole in the floor. The building he was in, being rickety and old, seemed a good choice for that. He had a keyhole saw and a brace and bit with him. We'd thought this through very carefully. We didn't want to leave any evidence of our visit. That's why we wanted to do it through a hole in the floor, rather than an easier method of breaking a window and throwing Homer's bomb through. So we watched and waited and shivered, glancing at our watches, then at each other, then anxiously back at the outpatients department. When the action did happen, it happened with knobs on. We hadn't wasted our evening sneaking into the house after house in Barrable Avenue to find ping-pong balls. Homer had promised us a worthwhile result as he wrapped the balls in foil. We had watched, fascinated, not prepared to cast doubts as we went through back into the evacuation of the A.C. Heron High School just 6 months earlier. It had certainly worked then, and it worked now. Suddenly, sharp, loud beeps started to emerge from Homer's end of the building, and almost immediately, through the clear night air, came a series of announcements. These were in English and loud enough for us to hear. They seemed to come from all over the hospital. I think they were pre-recorded and came on automatically. The first one was Code 2, Code 2, Code 2, repeated every 15 or 20 seconds. After a minute or so came the next message, Zone 4, Zone 4, Zone 4. Then, Level 3, Level 3. By now the hospital was stirring into life. Lights were coming on everywhere, and we could hear people calling out. A second round of announcements began. The same as the first, I think. But by then I'd stopped concentrating on them. Instead, Lee and I were creeping forward, looking for our chance. I couldn't see any smoke actually emerging from the end of the outpatients, but the people coming out of the ward were all heading in that direction. There were 2 soldiers running, then a few men and women in ordinary clothes, then a woman in a nurse's uniform, and 3 or 4 people in pajamas. I couldn't see their faces, so I couldn't tell which ones were friends, if any, but it was quite a party for 2 o'clock in the morning. We didn't want to do any harm to sick people. Homer's smoke bomb was guaranteed not to start a fire, and we were hoping that the staff wouldn't rush around evacuating patients. We had gambled that the hospital would have a fire detection system that could be triggered by smoke, and that it would still be working. It wasn't a very big gamble, pretty much a certainty, and the staff had reacted as we hoped they would. They hurried to the side of the alarm, and they left doors open everywhere. We didn't have much time. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Fee and Chris moving quickly to the door into the main wards. Lee and I had the old people's wing as our target. In the long section of the T-shaped building, Lee and I had the old people's wing as our target, a long section of the T-shaped building. Only one person had come from there, a soldier, and he or she had flung the door shut, but so hard that it bounced open again. I set off, half a stride ahead of Lee. I was hoping we could sneak across the car park, not being noticed, but once we entered the great bare black desert, I realised our only chance was speed. I put my head down and sprinted, hoping the footsteps behind me were Lee's. The night air was cold on my face, but colder was the chill down my neck and back, the fear of the ripping bullets. I got to the door puffing, gasping, and grateful to be alive. Time was so short. All I could do was stick my head through the door and look to left and right. The old wooden corridor was empty of people, so I went in, trusting to Lee to follow me. He did, so closely that I could feel his breath around my ears. Although the corridor was empty, you could sense that the building was full of people. I don't know what it is, but the little sounds maybe, the creaks, the shuffling noises, or maybe it's the smell of human bodies and breath, or the warmth that fills the place, the close humid warmth that heaters and fireplaces can never generate. So I knew right away that there were people everywhere, behind all the closed doors, along the corridor. I made an instant decision to turn right, not for any particular reason, I just did it, walking quickly along, trying to decide which door to go through, wishing for X-ray vision. We passed a small kitchen with an open door. It was empty and in darkness. The next room, labelled B7, no light showed under the door. The next room was labelled B7. No light showed under the door. I stopped, looked around at Lee, and indicated the door by raising my eyebrows and pointing to it. He shrugged and nodded. I took a deep breath, hunched my shoulders, squeezed the handle tight, and turned it and opened the door. Inside, all was dark. Not only were the lights off, but the curtains were drawn too. Yet again, I knew it was full of people. It seemed such a small room, but so full of people. There was a lot of heavy breathing, some slow and deep, some quavery and long. I stood there trying to get used to the darkness, not knowing whether to risk speaking or not, but Lee tapped me on the shoulder and I followed him back into the corridor. "This is bloody risky," he said. He was sweating heavily. We heard a noise down the corridor and turned quickly towards it. The door from the car park was being opened again. Suddenly we had no choice. We made a dash for the nearest door, which was B8. I tried to open the door as quietly as possible, but there wasn't much time for subtlety. We fell into the room together, making a fair bit of noise. Lee shut the door quickly behind us as a voice asked aggressively, "Who is it?" I felt such relief that she spoke in English. It was a woman's voice, someone quite young, 25 or 30 maybe. "We're looking for a friend," I said quickly. This was the first conversation I'd had with an adult since the invasion. "Who are you?" she asked again. I hesitated and finally answered honestly. "I don't know if it's safe to say." There was a pause, then in a voice quivering with astonishment, she said, "Do you mean you aren't prisoners?" "That's right." "Well, bloody hell, I didn't think there was anyone left." "Are we safe in here?" Lee asked. How many of you are there?" "Only 2, I said. "Well, you're probably safe till morning. Sorry I growled at you when you came in, but you never know around here. Sometimes attack's the best method of defense." "Look, old Mrs. Simpson's next to me. She's in a proper bed. The only one who is. Hop under there and you'll be hidden if anyone turns the light on. God, I can't believe this."
We groped our way to the bed and wriggled under it. Mrs. Simpson smelt pretty bad, but we tried to ignore that. "What's happening?" I asked. "Who are you? Who else is in here?" "Well, I'm Nell Ford. Used to work at the hairdresser's. My husband Stuart worked for Jack Colviner. We were building that new brick place out on Sherlock Road, past the truck yard." "Are you a patient?" "God, yeah. You've got to be pretty sick to get in here, but I'm out tomorrow. Or the next day. Back to the showground." "So are all the patients in here prisoners?" "In this building? Yeah. They've shoved us in here like sardines, and they've given themselves the good wards over in the main section. Do you have nurses? And doctors? She laughed, but bitterly. We've got one nurse, Phyllis Desteger. Do you know her? And the doctors are allowed to come over occasionally when they're not treating the soldiers. If we get them for half an hour every second day, we're lucky. We have to look after ourselves, basically. It's pretty rough. How many people are in this room? 7. It's a bugger for infections. Anyway, what are you kids doing here? Did you say you were looking for somebody? Under the dusty bed, lying next to Lee, talking in whispers, I tensed myself, pressing my fingernails hard into my palms. Do you know Corrie Mackenzie? I asked, and Kevin Holmes. Oh, so you were with them, were you? She said. Well, that all fits together. I know who you are now. You're the ones who blew up the bridge. I was sweating furiously. I didn't know we were so notorious. I didn't answer, and Nell laughed. Don't worry, she said. I'm not a talker. Well, I suppose you want to know how your mates are. Yes, please, I whispered. Kevin's all right now. He's back at the showground. Poor little Corrie. She paused. I felt an awful, impossible weight inside my chest. My heart. Well, love? What? Look, she's pretty crook, love. All I could think was that she was alive. Where is she? Oh, she's in here, 2 doors down, but like I said, she's pretty crook. How do you mean? Well, love, she's still out to it. You know what I mean? Unconscious. She's been that way since she got here. She's not too good. Can we go and see her? Of course you can, love, but just wait a bit longer. The guards are due to come around soon. They only do 1 patrol a night, but there was a fire alarm before, so they might be late. That was us, Lee said. It was the only way we could distract them, so we could get in here. They say you kids have been pretty smart. Tell me more about Corrie, I begged. Tell me about everything. Nell sighed. Oh dear, I wish I could think of some good news. But, you know, they've been pretty rough with her. Young Kev drove her right into casualty, and at first they let the doctor have a look at her, but when they found it was a bullet wound, they turned nasty. They locked her in a room and wouldn't let anyone see her till the doctors jacked up. But even then, it was ages before she got any proper treatment, and a lot longer before they moved her over here for us to take care of her. The soldiers kept saying she was a bad girl. Bad girl. Maybe she was lucky, being unconscious. You know, better off. But the poor kid, she just lies there. They finally got a drip into her, but she doesn't seem to be getting any better. We do everything we can. She's the only one in a room on her own. But someone always sits with her. It's Mrs. Slater tonight. You know her? There was a long silence. For the first time I felt real hatred for the soldiers. It was such a dark, evil force that frightened me. It was as though black vomit was filling me, as though a demon inside was spewing black stuff into my guts. I was frightened at everything. The hatred I felt, the state Corrie was in, the risks Lee and I were running by being here. Do you know how our families are? Lee asked. Nell gave a little gurgle. I'll have to know who you are before I can answer that, she said. Was I right, what I said before? So we told her. We didn't know if she was trustworthy or not, but our need to know was greater than our sense of caution. Nell, like all hairdressers, knew everything about everyone. My parents were okay, although my father had had a rifle shoved into his guts the first day of the invasion when he got too aggressive, and he'd been knocked down a couple of times since for the same reason. I'd always been afraid of that. Farmers are so used to being their own bosses, they don't like being told what to do anymore, including their daughters. They don't like being told what to do by anyone, including their daughters. Dad would have been purple in the face when he realised that these guys from another country were going to lock him up and order him around for the next few years, or for the rest of his life. Lee's family were alright too, though again, they'd had a rough time at first. They'd put up a fight when the soldiers arrived and hauled them out of their restaurant. Maybe, too, they were given a harder time because they were Asian. Anyway, Lee's father got a broken arm and his mother got 2 black eyes, but the little kids were okay, just shocked. Most of the others seemed well enough, except for Homer's brother, George, slicing his hand open when he was cutting vegetables for a meal, and Fee's little sister getting some bad asthma attacks. But life at the showground sounded terrible. Nell said they were too crowded, the sewerage system couldn't cope. Often there wasn't enough food to go around. There were a couple of showers in the horse pavilion for the grooms, but no one was allowed to use them, so they all stank and itched. Scratches and cuts got infected easily, and there were epidemics all the time. The current one was chickenpox, the last one had been mumps. People were depressed and bad-tempered and tired. There were fights all the time, some people not talking to other people, a few attempts at suicide, a dozen deaths. Most of these were old people, some who'd been kicked out of the hospital, but one had been a baby, and one a girl of 20 named Angela Bates, who'd been murdered. No one knew much about it. They found a body dumped outside the Dunnies one morning. Everyone was sure it was the soldiers, of course, but complaining to them was a waste of time. The murder remained unsolved. There had been some rapes while people were being rounded up and brought into the showground, but none since. Nell said the soldiers there were well disciplined most of the time, but they'd bashed dozens of people who disobeyed orders. A guy called Spike Faraday, a young cocky from out near Champion Hill, had been shot in the kneecap for assaulting a soldier, and 6 people who tried to escape had been bashed and dragged off to the Wirrawee lockup. Another Spike, a guy called Spike Florence, a jackaroo, had been beaten up repeatedly because he just wouldn't back down, kept antagonizing the guards. It was all much worse than we'd thought. The little information we'd picked up from prisoners' work parties and the comments on the radio about a clean invasion had lulled us into a false sense of optimism. Things seemed to be deteriorating. There was nothing clean about all this. I wanted to go and wash my hands. There were 2 things Nell said from her mattress on the floor that really shocked me. One was when she told us that a lot of people were cooperating with the soldiers. I didn't know what to think when I heard that. I hadn't read a lot of war books or seen a lot of war movies, but I'd always had the impression that the goodies in them were all heroes. You were on one side or the other, either a goodie or a baddie, and you stayed that way from start to finish. Nell said that some people were sucking up to the soldiers, real brown noses, and what's more, some of them were actively helping, offering to do jobs for the guards and going out of their way to support them. Others were spending the night with them. We were both bewildered. Why? Lee said. Why are they doing that? Nell laughed her little bitter laugh that I was getting used to. Listen, love, she whispered. I'm a hairdresser, and hairdressers are all amateur psychologists. We reckon we know everything there is to know about people. But I've seen stuff at the showground that I'll never figure out. Not if I live to be a million. Who knows what goes on in the brains of those bastards? Some of them do it because they're scared. Some do it for food or cigarettes or grog, or even for a shower and a bottle of shampoo. Some do it because they want to get power for themselves, I reckon. Some are such sheep that they like being told what to do. They don't care who's giving the orders, as long as there's someone doing it. Personally, I reckon they're mad. Things are going to get worse before they get better. There was another silence, while we digested all of this. I didn't seem able to focus on anything except the word sheep. Most people are so rude about them, but you won't find many farmers talking that way. So I said, you're wrong about sheep, Nell. They don't like obeying orders, and they're not as stupid as people make out. They have a good set of survival instincts. Oh, shut up, Ellie, came Lee's tired voice. I can't help it if I like sheep. Nell started telling us the second thing that shocked us. She said lots of people, our people, were looking forward to what the soldiers called the colonization. What this meant was that when the soldiers were satisfied they had the country under control, they would bring in millions of their own people. Each family would get some acres of land and they'd farm that using us as slave labour to do all the crap jobs, crutching sheep, digging spuds, cleaning houses. Why are they looking forward to that? I whispered. I was getting thoroughly scared, deep down. It seemed that everything was becoming too bad, too awful, and there was no hope for any of us. Oh well, Nell said. She was getting vague and was too tired. If you were in the showground, you'd understand. It's so awful in there, so crowded. We just want to get out, fresh air, being able to walk around. That's why people volunteer for the work parties now. Seems like any change would be a good change. It was while she was telling us this that the soldiers did their check. We heard them easily enough. They weren't making any special effort to be quiet. They opened the door to the room and flashed the lights on, then turned them off again a second later. It was so long since I'd been in a room with electric lighting that I felt like I'd been bashed over the head. It was so powerful. Lee and I flattened ourselves, breathing in dust and the smell of old wood. "They don't normally turn the lights on," Nell whispered after they'd gone. "Your fire alarm might have spooked them a bit." Still, I was sure they couldn't have worked out the source of the smoke, or there would have been a much more frenzied search. Home had carried a sack to throw over the smoke bomb when they burst into the room above him. All they would have found was a room full of smoke with no obvious cause. He'd been aiming for the X-ray department because with its complicated electrical equipment they wouldn't have known what to blame. We heard the tread of the soldiers' footsteps as they returned down the corridor to their post. At last, the moment I'd prayed for had arrived. I wanted it so badly, but why did I feel so frightened? I suppose I didn't know what I'd see in B10. My best friend, my oldest mate, Corrie, or some kind of unrecognizable monster, a vegetable. "You ought to be safe now," Nell was whispering. "Just be careful." I didn't really need that advice. I wasn't about to go cooeying down the corridor or playing demolition derby with the trolleys. We slithered out from under our bed like snakes from a blackberry bush. "Good luck," Nell said. "We'll come and see you before we go." "Righto, love." I opened the door gingerly and peered out. The passageway was quite dark and empty. It was cold after the close, warm human smell of B8. As lightly as possible I fled along the corridor, knowing Lee was with me. But when we got to Corrie's door, I didn't have the courage to open it. Since the invasion, I'd had to reach for courage so many times. Surprisingly to myself, it had always been there, even if sometimes I'd had to dredge deeply, even if sometimes there hadn't been much left to draw on. Now I just leaned weakly against the door, my head pressed into it. That was not a smart thing to do. Not quite as bad as yelling "Cooey" or going for rides in the wheelchairs, but not far off it. Lee put his arm around me and I turned and buried my head in his chest. I didn't cry, but I was grateful for his strong hand and his silent understanding. Deep inside Lee, there seemed to be a place that I didn't think I had. Maybe it was the place his music came from. Whatever it was, I connected with it then for a few seconds and gained a little strength. It was like a blood transfusion. "Would you go first?" I asked, lifting my head out of his nice warm chest. He did, letting me go, twisting the handle of the door and opening it. He went in and held the door open for me. I slipped in there, into the darkness. A frightened voice gasped, "Who's there?" For a moment I thought it was Corrie, and I too gasped. I thought it was a ghost or a miracle, that Corrie had suddenly recovered consciousness and was talking to us. Then I remembered Mrs. Slater. "It's me, Mrs. Slater, Ellie, and Lee's here too." "Ellie, oh Lee!" She jumped up, knocking something over. We knew Mrs. Slater pretty well. She was one of those people who packed about 32 hours into every 24-hour. Her husband had died in a tractor accident years ago, and since then she'd run the farm, raised the kids, written 2 gardening books, learnt calligraphy and quilting, and done half an arts degree through the Open University. She even found time to do canteen duty at school. Her last kid, Jason, was in year 10. She'd said to me once, "There are 2 kinds of people in this world, Ellie, the ones who watch TV and the ones who get things done." Now she gave me the biggest hug of my career, and finally I cried. It had been a long time since the last tear, but she was the first adult I'd seen who I knew, the first one to hug me, the first link with my old, loved, happy world, the first link with my parents because she was such a good friend of Mum's. "Oh, Ellie," she said, "you poor kid, and you smell terrible." "Oh, Mrs. Slater," she made me laugh, and I thumped her in the chest in protest. Then she hugged Lee. I guess we'd been living together so long we didn't notice how bad we smelt. We took regular baths in the creek, but with the water getting so cold we hadn't been doing it a lot lately. "Don't worry," she said, "they all smell worse at the showground. A lot worse. But we patients get a shower every second day, so we forget." But I wasn't listening anymore. I turned to the bed, where Corrie lay so silently. The only light in the room came from the car park, through the windows. You could see where condensation had misted the glass. The room itself was very dim, like a church in the late afternoon before the lights come on. The things that stood out were the things that were very dark and the things that were very light. A cupboard door was like a dark scar on the wall. The bedside locker was a white shape crouching watchfully beside Corrie's bed. It seemed quite bright. The sheet that covered Corrie glowed with a quiet luminosity. Her head on the pillow was a little black patch, an unmoving round stone. I could not make out her features. I tried to see her eyes, her nose, her mouth. Not seeing them, I was suddenly frightened of the black patch, as though it was not human, was not Corrie at all. I peered and peered, fighting to keep the fear in my stomach, to stop it coming up my throat and into my mouth. Was that her mouth, or just a shadow? Were those her eyes, or just black marks, tricks of the light? I wasn't aware of Lee or Mrs. Slater. Not only were they not in the room, they had ceased to exist. There was just me and the shape in the bed. I slowly took 3 short steps towards her, and suddenly, with the different angle and the light falling differently across the bed, I found Corrie again. There she was, her soft skin, her plump face, her closed eyes. My own mouth was slightly open in wonder, because she looked so different to the Corrie of my past friendship and the Corrie of my fearful imaginings. She did not look gaunt and battered and bruised, but neither did she look happy and lively and talkative. She looked like a wax doll, a fully formed impression of Corrie. I could see her lips move slightly with each breath in and breath out, but there was no other movement. She was alive, yet somehow not with us anymore. I was not scared of her, but I was scared to touch her. I had meant to ask Mrs. Slater if I could touch, if it was safe, but now that thought had fled my mind. So after a while I leant forward with a shivering finger and ran the tip of it down the side of her right cheek. This was not the Corrie who I hugged and used as a pillow and beat up on. The Corrie who'd sat on my lap so often on the crowded school bus. That Corrie had slipped quietly away, leaving behind this peacefully breathing, pale replacement. I leant further forward and kissed her on the forehead, then lay my head on the pillow beside her. I didn't say anything. I didn't really think anything either. Her skin was cool, but I didn't notice that at the time. Just thought about it afterwards. Through her cheek, next to mine, I could feel her breathing. I stayed like that for some time, a long time. Finally, I got up again and whispered in her ear, "Take care out there, Corrie. Look after yourself." And I slipped out into the corridor and waited for Lee. I didn't even say goodbye to Mrs. Slater, which was a bit rude. Lee was quite a while, so I hid behind a laundry basket, but eventually he came out. I popped up and went ahead of him back to B8 to say goodbye to Nell. "Are you okay, love?" she asked. "Did it upset you?" But I didn't answer that. Instead, I asked her a question that had been bugging me. "You know how you said before that Kevin was all right now?" I asked. "Oh, did I?" "Yes, you did. What did you mean now?" She tried to think of a reassuring lie, but she couldn't. After a minute of silence, she gave in and told me. "They beat him up pretty bad, Ellie." We snuck along the corridor towards the exit. We knew from Nell where the soldiers would be, at the nurse's station near the exit door. Hiding in the little kitchen about 20 meters away, I grabbed Lee's head and pulled it down so I could whisper in his ear. "I want to find a knife." "Why?" "So I can kill the soldiers." I felt his body give a little jerk, like he'd touched the terminals of a battery, but he didn't say anything for a minute, just stood up straight. While I continued to crouch beside him like the animal I'd become, then he bent down again and put his mouth to my ear. "You can't do that, Ellie." "Why not?" "There'd be reprisals against the patients." We didn't speak again, just waited. We were waiting for a break in the soldiers' routine, a chance to slip past their defences. We could hear them talking occasionally in their guttural language. There was a kind of wailing music in their voices that was almost attractive. Occasionally, too, we could hear a girl's voice, low and husky, usually laughing, sometimes making a comment that sounded like English, but pitched too low for us to make out the words. After what Nell had said, I had the worst suspicions of what the girl was doing, and I raged against her, there in the darkness. One soldier walked past our little hidey hole to go to the toilet, but we couldn't tell where the other one was, so we dared not move. That was at 3:45 a.m. He returned a few minutes later, and there was no other movement till 4:20, when the other one made the same trip to the toilet. Seconds later, a tall girl, maybe about 19, appeared at our kitchen door and whispered into the darkness facing towards us. "Quick, the other one's asleep, but don't make any noise." We were startled, wondering for a moment if she could possibly be talking to us. Then we realized that she must be. We rose and slipped around the food trolleys towards the door. The girl had already gone. Who was she? How did she know we were there? I still don't know the answers to those questions, but whoever she was, and whatever else she might have been doing, I know we owe her something special.